Great. Today we're going to be talking about the UC Berkeley Library data collections. My name is Anna Sackmann. I'm the Data Services Librarian here at UC Berkeley, and I largely work with liaisons and researchers to identify data that's needed by the UC Berkeley community. And in my role, I try to shepherd data through the acquisition process. There are other things that I do, but this is a big component of it. So everything from the first kind of initial request to we want to buy this data through licensing, the data file transfer, and then ensuring that our researchers and students can access the data that we've purchased for them to use. And now I'll let my colleague Samantha introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Teramy. I'm the licensing librarian at the Berkeley Library, and I handle all of our contract negotiation for all e-resources that we license, including data, but also ebooks, e-journals, media, everything you can think of. And we'll turn it back over to Anna to get started with the presentation.
So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about, in general, our libraries and our collections, and then how data fits into this. And I'll talk about the kinds of data that we buy. I will give a spoiler at the very beginning here. I don't have a data budget. So I don't have money that can just buy any and all data. And we can talk more about how we actually pay for the data in a little bit. We'll go over licensing data at the library and what might be different with the library's process than other parts of the university. And then we'll end with managing and accessing the data, and we'll close with questions and plenty of time for discussion. So data at the UC Berkeley Library. To kick things off, I want to talk about the UC Berkeley libraries and our collections. We have 25 physical locations, and I want my library colleagues to please correct me in the chat if I'm misstating any of this. But I thought it would be nice to start out with one of our collection statements. The UC Berkeley Library exists within a rapidly changing information and research landscape. Technological advancements have revolutionized the way our university community accesses and uses information in their teaching, learning, and research work. We are committed to supporting our faculty, students, and staff by pushing the boundaries of scholarly resource access and acquisition strategies. And I say this in part because the depth and breadth of what we do is more than books and journals, even though it is a very large component of that. I'm going to give you two visualizations here just to give you a sense of how much we actually have at our libraries. This is a pretty watered down chart. I wanted to make it a little bit more simple for you to look at of just our physical items at the title level and what we have at the library. So if you look at maps, just physical maps, it's 0.9% of our collection, but that 0.9% represents over 65,000 individual titles. With books, just titles, physical books, we have over 6.3 million, and that's a title. So one title could have tens of volumes behind it. This next chart is for our electronically accessed or digital items. And we have journals here, and again, books. I don't quite remember the number of book titles we have electronically, but one small piece of the pie I wanted to point out is like electronically available notated music is 1.7%, and that's about 55,000 different titles. Data, and you can see these other like tiny slivers of color in here. Data is not even on this chart because our numbers of data sets, while they're in the hundreds, it's just so small in comparison to the rest of our collections. So data is simply one type of information medium, and we collect all different types of information mediums. So I want to talk about data as this sort of piece of the collections pie. Academic libraries have been purchasing data from nonprofit, private, or commercial entities, probably in a very serious way for like the last 15 years. We've really been looking at it at UC Berkeley. There are a number of social science librarians, one of whom is on this call, who I will not call out, who have spent their entire careers thinking about data as part of our collections, as a very real piece of our collections. And a lot of the social science librarians have been grappling with how we license data and how we make it available to our users for a really long time. At UC Berkeley, we started looking at different workflows and ways to tackle the data acquisition process, like I said, about 15 years ago. And we've worked on a number of different models. Our most recent model was developed maybe 4 or 5 years ago in collaboration with a number of folks at the library. And we're really focused on purchasing data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we talk about the FAIR principles to our researchers, and we want to apply those same concepts to the data sets that we purchase. And the big difference here with the library in comparison to, say, a researcher who is purchasing data for themselves is that the data is licensed for all UC Berkeley users. We have a handful of data sets that are licensed for a very specific population on campus. Those are namely in the business library or a couple of economics resources, but we by and large don't do that. And when we look at a resource, we look at everyone using it on campus, everyone from a first-year undergrad who is maybe just getting their feet wet working with data, all the way through faculty and postdocs and getting them the data they need and making sure it's available to or licensed by use for everyone kind of in between. So what kinds of data do we buy? I wanted to break it out into 4 different chunks here, and these are just a handful of examples that I grabbed. This is certainly not everything. We buy a lot of financial and business data. So a couple of titles here that you might recognize are S&P Capital IQ, global financial data, and we have historical business data. We have recently been focusing a lot on election and voter data. So we have pretty extensive data sets on gubernatorial elections, House, Senate, and presidential races for the last several decades, voter turnout data, and then we also have the L2 data set, which is individual voter records. We have been extensively buying GIS or map data, and there's a really interesting intersection here between the GIS kind of coordinate data along with the social sciences. So we have planet data, which is a lot of high definition satellite imagery. And then we have resources like Policy Map and Social Explorer. We do have a separate GIS data portal, and I'll put that link in the chat when we finish today. And then we have citation data. So we were recently able to purchase Web of Science XML citation data, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Another piece of the data acquisition process that we look at are purchasing platforms, or I should say subscribing to platforms and APIs that help our researchers do text and data mining. So a lot of these are tools that they use to collect, say, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of articles to be able to run an analysis over the top to look at different trends that are occurring over time. We have 2 main platforms that folks have been using for the last couple of years. There's the Gale Digital Scholar, and that's really geared towards arts and humanities. A lot of historians use this platform. This enables people to kind of digitally mine more historical periodicals. They have the Economics Historical Archive, the Time Literary Archive. Then at the bottom, I have listed TDM Studio, which is all of our ProQuest content. This is by and large newspapers, journals, and dissertations. The catch with Gale Digital Scholar and TDM Studio is that you pull the text corpus into a computing environment that is managed by Gale or that is managed by ProQuest. So the user cannot download the corpus. They work with it within a Jupyter Notebook computing enclave that is managed uh, by ProQuest or by Gale. You can download code and results, but not the actual text, which is where the LexisNexis Web Services API comes in. We have 3 seats for this API where folks can download large numbers of legal dockets, company information, newspapers. And this is really heavily used by folks, particularly in the social sciences, a lot of faculty and graduate students, far fewer undergraduates. And then I want to highlight just a few notable acquisitions from the last year or so that I'm really excited about. The first one we have had access to for 15 days, which is called Dewey Data. And it's a platform of data vendors. There are about, I think, 28 or 30, those of you on the call who know more about this, feel free to chime in. Data sets from vendors that are pretty broad. So they'll have like rental data, construction permit data, location data, occupational data, a lot of company information. And we have researchers in, I think, 12 different departments who have requested this data platform over the years. I was also recently able to acquire the Web of Science XML dataset, which is all of the citation data for everything that is indexed in Web of Science going back to 1900. I'm really excited about that one. And then a few of you have likely heard of the L2 voter data. And this is individual voter data files for the entire United States that is updated monthly. It is personally identifiable, and we've been working with our partners over in Research IT to make sure all of the data remains in a secure enclave, and that folks who are accessing the data have agreed to the terms of data security for working with this type of data. So managing the data in the UC Berkeley Library, everything that we purchase, whether it's a subscription or a one-time acquisition, is stored in our UC Berkeley Library Dataverse. Other institutions use Dataverse for enabling researchers to publish their research data. We don't have a data curator, nor do we have the type of storage, archival storage available through the library to have Dataverse function in that way. So we are using Dataverse for all of our licensed data, which my hope is that it makes it easier for you to discover what data we actually do have. So the requirements for a data set to be in the UC Berkeley Library Dataverse is that it has to be available to all users without restriction to specific user groups. Like I mentioned, there are a few exceptions. The files are stored locally with the library, or there's a subscription. But if it's a subscription, it must be data-only content. I'm not putting content in Dataverse that has things like statistics or reports. And the data has to be manipulatable either in the platform that we subscribe to or after the data files have been downloaded. We have about 251 data sets in Dataverse right now. I think it's recently grown a little bit more in the past couple of weeks. And finally, this is just a screenshot of the homepage, and the URL is datasets.lib.berkeley.edu. And at this point, I am going to mute myself and pass it over to Samantha, who will talk about licensing.
Hey everyone. So I'm going to give you a rundown of kind of our team approach to data licensing. So as many of you may know, we've kind of rehauled the way we do licensing within the library. It used to just be the licensing librarian who would handle this, and now we've developed a team that consists of the AUL and subject specialty librarians. It also consists of our e-resources unit and acquisitions department, who are responsible for things like activation and invoicing. And of course, people like Anna who help consult on licenses within their area of expertise. So this is especially helpful for unique content like data and visual media, as the licensing terms differ a lot from standard ebook and e-journal licenses. So once a ticket is submitted to acquire a new resource or to renew an existing one, our data librarian will first do a review of the license and look for any red flags that need to be revised, especially as they pertain to how we provide the data, how it's stored, and any technical aspects that the licensing librarian may be less familiar with. Since the data librarian is more familiar with the specific resource and has a better understanding of how the data will actually be used by our authorized users, this first review is essential for making sure that our patrons have all the contractual usage rights that they may need and that the university isn't agreeing to technical requirements that we can't actually uphold. Once this is complete, the licensing librarian will conduct a substantive legal review focusing on legal heavy things like governing law, liability, and institutional and federal requirements. Then, once the contract has been fully negotiated and signed, it will be passed to folks in charge of invoicing and activation, who will continue to consult with the data librarian on any logistical questions. The licensing librarian and the data librarian will work together to highlight any specific terms that they are required to inform authorized users of when using the specific data set, which is quite common for us. Particularly for data licenses, we are obligated to inform our authorized users of their specific usage requirements in a way that we are not for ebooks. So the data librarian will then ensure that those terms are properly reflected in the dataset's individual record and that the Dataverse platform requires the user to view and accept said terms before they can download any of that data. Additionally, a new guideline that we've implemented in the last couple of years is renegotiating all of our older contracts, which I found that a lot of institutions don't do, either because it's an oversight or due to time and staffing constraints. However, by renegotiating, we ensure that the terms and conditions are in line with current university standards around accessibility, fair use, privacy of personally identifiable information, and more. This is especially as important as the information landscape is quickly changing in regards to TDM and AI, so we want to make sure that our users' academic needs are expressly allowed for. So at Berkeley, if we find during the renewal process that a resources governing contract is 5 years old and over $10,000, or if it's just 7 years old, regardless of price, we will complete a substantive legal review and renegotiate that master contract. Renegotiation was not being done in years prior, but we found that we're almost always able to secure better and more expansive usage rates for our users by taking the time to update our contracts. Now, in regards to data, the primary issue with licensing is that many vendors are not as familiar with working with academic institutions. Anna, could you flip the slide? Rather, data vendors tend to contract with corporate entities. Academic institutions have much different data usage needs than institutional restrictions than corporations. So we often find ourselves explaining things that we tend to take for granted in other license negotiations with academically minded publishers, such as fair use or interlibrary loan that data vendors just aren't familiar with. One example is that we often have to go into great detail to explain that customer, the university, and authorized users, our students and faculty, need separate definitions within our contract, since we're licensing use of this resource on behalf of our students and faculty, not on behalf of use of the university itself. Though a corporation is similarly licensing the data so that their employees can utilize it, the company is ultimately benefiting from use of the data and is directing their employees on what to do with that data. Whereas at a university, the university is not directly benefiting from a student conducting individual research using the data, and the university has no say in what the student chooses to research or how they plan to use that data. So what works for corporate entities doesn't necessarily work for universities. Additionally, as you may or may not be familiar with, new accessibility regulations in Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, were recently passed, which requires that public entities like UC Berkeley provide e-resources according to the Web Content and Access Guidelines at level 2.1 AA, even if that content is behind an authentication wall and not publicly viewable, so all of our licensed e-resources. Since these are federal regulations, not just a university standard, we will not move forward with licenses unless we can secure some sort of accessibility language, be it an express warranty of compliance with WCAG 2.1 or a VPAT showing the vendor's roadmap towards compliance. These accessibility requirements still do apply to data. However, we make distinctions between data with visual aspects like charts and graphs versus raw data that can be downloaded in simple Excel files. With raw data, there isn't much you can do to make the data more accessible than it already is. So although we always ask for a warranty of accessibility compliance because it's best practice to ask for what you want, we will still move forward with the license if the vendor does not agree to include our language. In comparison to other typical e-resources, many data vendors are reluctant to provide accessibility warranties or VPATs, so this can be a bit of a struggle to secure, especially if purchasing data from one vendor that is hosted on a platform by another vendor. In these cases, it's essential to find out whether the data vendor or the platform host is ultimately responsible for accessibility. In these cases, it's often the platform host since they're responsible for making the data viewable to users, but you can still request that the data vendor provides a representation that their content is accessible at the time it's provided to the platform host. Lastly, a few clauses tend to come up around data deletion requirements when terminating the contract, taking liability for authorized users, and how the content will be hosted. I'd like to go through some of these clauses and show you actual clauses that we've redlined in our contracts and how we've amended them. So for instance, this is a data deletion clause that's pretty standard in most of our data contracts. Um, as you can imagine, we can't actually control whether students delete all of the data that they've downloaded. So we have changed this to use our little phrase that we love in licensing, use reasonable efforts to. So we're not promising to really do anything except to try to delete all that data post termination of the contract. We've also deleted immediately. There's not really a legal definition for immediately necessarily, but we want to ensure that we have time and space to actually meet that requirement and that we're allowing our IT folks and everyone involved in the process to have the time and space to complete this task. Next, uh, this is a clause about the university assuming liability for its authorized users. Now, this is something we actually never agree to for any e-resource, regardless of whether it's data or an e-journal. This is just a university policy that we have. If we were to agree to this, we would actually have to go to UC Berkeley's general counsel to get special approval for it. And likely they're not going to do that unless it's a very unique and special resource that we need for some reason. Um, so we kind of have like a bag of tricks here. A lot of people will think it's either we take liability or we don't. But we typically tend to start with this red line language at the top that instead of taking liability for our authorized users, we will just take liability for our own actions, so university staff members. If that doesn't work, we've implemented a lot of strategies to kind of get around this and work with vendors. So we offer to inform all of our authorized users of the terms of the agreement, and we do so in Dataverse frequently. So they have that little term section in each individual record that users can see before they actually access the data. If the vendor is not satisfied with that, we offer that they can hold authorized users individually liable by creating click-throughs. That's something that the vendor would need to do on their end. We don't tend to create the click-throughs ourselves. And the individual authorized user would have to decide whether they want to take on that liability for their own use, as the university isn't involved in that, even though we're securing the data for them. And then lastly, if we hit all roadblocks possible, we have agreed to assume liability for authorized users only to the extent that a breach occurs due to the university's own gross and willful misconduct. This is really unlikely. Obviously, we're not letting our users misuse the data. We're not encouraging that. We're not letting them share passwords. So that's something that will really never come up, but it does give the vendor a little bit of security that if we are purposefully misusing the product, then they will have indemnification rights. And then next, this has been a big one lately. So in most contracts, you have an order of precedence with all of the agreement terms. So you have the master agreement, which usually prevails above everything. You'll have any subsequent order forms, addendums, and then you have the general online terms that pretty much all publishers will have for their content on their website. So this is pretty standard. We've recently started adding that in the event that general online terms are more restrictive than the agreement, that the master agreement will prevail. So as you can see, the original language just says any conflict, which oftentimes there isn't a conflict between the language. For example, our master agreement will remain completely silent on artificial intelligence usage, but the general online terms will say you can't use AI. So there's no conflict because our agreement doesn't say you can use AI. So with this actually makes it so that our users can do things like use AI as long as our contract is silent or more permissive than the general online terms. And this has come up recently in emails that have surfaced. So we're pretty excited about this because we found that a lot of publishers have just been quietly sneaking AI restrictions into their online terms of use. This is especially useful if we already preserve fair use within our master agreement, which we try to do in all of our agreements, regardless of content type. So if Anna will switch to the next slide. This is one we just recently did last week, Anna and I. So the original language said basically that with this content, you can do X, Y, Z. And so we changed it to say that you can make all uses that are consistent with fair use, plus you can do X, Y, Z. And the vendor actually accepted it, no qualms about it, didn't try to negotiate with us at all. And so that was really exciting. And because we consider AI, most AI usage to be a fair use, AI usage and TDM and things of that nature would be included under fair use, meaning that as long as there's not specific language in our contract that says no AI usage, then users would be able to use AI and train AI using the content that we're licensing, even if the general online terms say that they can't, because that's more restrictive than our master agreement. So all of these clauses kind of work together to fit different pieces of the puzzle and give us the most expansive usage rights possible. And that's my chunk on licensing. So we'd love to open the floor up to questions if you have any questions on data licensing for either of us.
And I am going to go to our last slide, and I think these slides will be shared. We have a link to an e-resource licensing ebook that Samantha wrote along with a couple of her colleagues that really gets into the nitty-gritty of an approach to licensing and particularly around it. I think there's a chapter on AI.
Yeah, there is a chapter on AI. We're hoping to add a data chapter in the coming years, but this was written by myself and Rachel Sandberg from the Scholarly Communications Office, as well as a couple colleagues from MIT, Harvard, and Stanford.
And I will put the link to this book in the chat in just a second. I'm going to stop sharing so we can open it up to questions.